What's up, everybody, and welcome back to retrogamergenx's Retro Gaming channel. Today, we're going to be taking a look at retro gaming history from the 1990s, everything from the Super Nintendo all the way up to the Sega Dreamcast. At the end of each year, I always make these compilation videos where it's basically all my look at videos and all my history videos put together all into these huge videos. Now, this year it would have been well over 4 hours long. So I actually had to break it up by decades. So I have the 1970s and the 1980s. So if you guys want to go ahead and check those ones out, you can go ahead and take a look at them right there. But this one is for the 1990s. I mean, what a great decade it was, where we just kind of went into the whole 3D perspective. We went away from sprite graphics up into polygon graphics, and everything just kind of changed at that point. We actually had consoles that were networking with one another. It was just a different time within the gaming community. Now, with all that being said, guys, I did want to thank all my subscribers and all my viewers for all the support that you've given me for the past year and a half doing these kind of videos. It's just been an excellent ride, just showing all you guys all the history about all these video game consoles and computers. Now, if you guys like the content, go ahead and hit a like button and then hit subscribe as well if you want to go ahead and subscribe to me and hit that notification bell. That way you get notifications every time I drop new content like this. And if you want to help support the channel, go ahead and hit that super thanks heart down below. Any support that I get from you guys would be greatly appreciated, and I'll go ahead and roll you in the credits at the end of every episode. All right, without any further ado, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at the history of retro video game consoles of the 1990s.
When you decide to step up to this kind of power, this kind of challenge, this kind of flying, crashing, feeling, when you decide to get serious, there's only one place to come: the games of Super Nintendo. No one else creates this kind of experience, because no one else creates these kinds of games. Now you're playing with power, superpower.
The story of the SNES starts in 1987. A newcomer to the gaming industry, NEC, had just released the 16-bit PC engine in Japan. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had seen NEC and its product as a strong competitor to the NES, which started to worry Nintendo. At this point, sales of the NES were still great, but Yamauchi knew this would not last long with the great graphics and sound that the PC engine was able to produce. Also in 1987, it was announced that Sega was about to launch their 16-bit system, the Mega Drive. In September of 1987, Nintendo announced the development of the Super Famicom and a new Super Mario Bros. 4 game. The system was being developed by none other than Masayuki Uemura, who had developed the NES. Nintendo at this time was worried more about the NEC than Sega. The reason for this is that Sega had released a few consoles in the 8-bit era, but were completely overshadowed by the Famicom and the NES. Nintendo was really not in a hurry to develop the new 16-bit system because sales of the NES were still going good. However, this did not last long. Some feel Nintendo made this announcement in 1987 to stall sales of the PC engine during the Christmas season. In 1988, Sega released the Mega Drive, and the PC engine was picking up steam as well. NES sales started to slump, and Nintendo knew they had to get a new system on the market. Development went into full swing, but since Nintendo was so late to the game, it took a couple years to develop. The first prototypes of the system were shown to the public in 1988, and again before its launch in Japan in 1989. In 1989, both Sega and NEC had released their systems in North America, but changed the names to TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis. By the time the Super Famicom was ready to be launched, Sega was starting to take a lead in the gaming industry. With a good amount of games in its library, NEC was no slouch either. Nintendo for the first time had to deal with true competition. This marked one of the greatest console wars in history: Sega versus Nintendo. Nintendo released the Super Famicom in 1990 in Japan, and it instantly sold out of the 300,000 units that were made. The system was then released in North America under the name Super Nintendo in 1991. Also around this time, Nintendo was aware of the CD add-on that Sega was about to release, and wanted one for their own Super NES system so it could stay competitive. They had contracted out with Sony to develop the CD add-on named, you guessed it, the PlayStation. However, during the CES show in 1991, Nintendo reneged on their deal with Sony to produce it and went with Philips. Possibly one of the worst mistakes Nintendo ever made, birthing a monster in the gaming industry to this day, Sony's PlayStation. Philips went on to develop the CDI when Nintendo discontinued the CD add-on, but Philips still had a contract with Nintendo. This is why we have those weird CDI Zelda and Mario games like Hotel Mario and Zelda's Adventure. Once again, Nintendo had a lot of publishers developing for it, and unlike the Genesis, the games could be enhanced with special chips in the carts for sound and graphics. Also, it was capable of pseudo 3D graphics. During this time, sales of the system skyrocketed. As most older gamers used the Genesis, younger gamers chose the SNES. This was all part of the console war. This is a strategy that worked to top Sega then, but would not work on future consoles, as it was shown by Sony's marketing of the PS1 to older gamers in the market, while Nintendo was still marketing to kids with the N64. The SNES went on to sell just under 50 million units worldwide, being launched in 1990 in Japan and finally being discontinued in the UK in 2005, giving the system an amazing 15-year lifespan, making it one of the longest lasting game systems to ever hit the market.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD? What are you waiting for? Nintendo to make one? You have seen the games, right? Wrong answer, man. Show 'em! Want to see more?
The story of the Sega CD really starts in Japan in 1988. NEC was rumored to release a CD-ROM based system by the end of the year. Sega had just released the Sega Mega Drive in Japan to compete with the 16-bit PC Engine. But NEC was looking to step up the game with an add-on to the PC Engine called the PC Engine CD-ROM. Sega knew that the CD-ROM was the media of the future and decided to develop its own add-on CD-ROM system for the Sega Mega Drive. Sega did not have the capability to make its own CD-ROM system, so it partnered with JVC to help. Sega enlisted Tomio Tamaki to lead this project. Sega wanted a CD-ROM based system that could match or even outperform the PC Engine CD-ROM. They originally decided to double the amount of RAM that the NEC version had, but this was not enough. Rumors started to fly that NEC was developing a different, more powerful CD add-on that was to be called the Super CD-ROM that would have up to 512 kilobytes of RAM. Sega upped the ante and decided to put 6 megabits of RAM into this system. But that was not all. They also decided to add another Motorola 68000 CPU, but clocked at 12.5 MHz, almost twice the speed of the Mega Drive CPU. On top of this, they added a custom GPU that could perform scaling and rotation effects. Also, not to be outdone with audio, they included a custom Riot sound chip that was capable of producing 10 channels of sound of audio, partnered with what the Mega Drive's YM2612 and SN76489 chips were providing for the system sound. The system would be able to play games, audio CDs, CDG video discs, and karaoke discs. The Mega CD was released in December of 1991 in Japan with only 2 games, Heavy Nova and Soul Feast. Other games released later that month included Nostalgia 1907, Ernest Evans, Funky Horror Band, and Tinka Fabu. But it wasn't until months later that games really started to hit the market. This led to sales in Japan being strong at first, but dying off quickly because the system really didn't have a great library at launch. During the development of the system, Sega was very protective of the technology that went into it. In fact, they were so secretive about it, they didn't even release a real version to Sega of America until it was almost too late. Sega of America had to procure its own ROM to put into the dummy unit to make it functional. To their dismay, the system had some major issues. The CD drive tray mechanism was flimsy and prone to break, but the worst issue was with the CD drive mech itself drawing too much current and releasing magic smoke from the system's capacitors. Rumor has it that the units actually caught on fire, but this is truly just a rumor. Only the caps blew, causing the system to smoke. The system was revised and released in North America as the Sega CD. When the Sega CD released in North America in October of '92, it was promised to have at least 20 games at launch, but Sega was not able to do this. It launched with 4 games. Unlike Japan, games started to be made right away, and by the end of the year there were 15 games published. Reception of the system is mixed. The system itself and the technology behind it was good, but the lack of games at launch time and the overuse of full motion video really didn't appeal to too many people. As time went on, the system never really caught on, but many great games were made for it. Also, games like Night Trap and Lethal Enforcers were instrumental at the beginning of the ESRB ratings for video games due to their sexual and violent content. The Sega CD was released in Japan in 1991 and discontinued in 1996, giving the console a 5-year lifespan. Although it seemed to be unpopular, it did sell over 2.2 million units with a total of 205 games being made. In my eyes, that's a pretty successful system for an add-on.
Do you believe your system is the most advanced in the universe? Let's review the numbers. Sega Genesis is 16 bits. 3DO is 32 bits. The Atari Jaguar is 64 bits. Which is more advanced? Clifford! 16 and 32 are less than 64. So with 64 bits, 3D graphics, real-world animation, and lightning speed that you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced? Clifford!
Can you repeat the question?
Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
The story of the Atari Jaguar actually starts in the mid-1980s with 4 different companies: Atari, Commodore, Sinclair, and Flare Technologies. Commodore's longtime president, Jack Tramiel, jumped ship from Commodore to Atari in 1984. At this point, Tramiel focused on selling the existing inventory of Atari's products and creating a new line of computers capable of competing with Apple's Macintosh, the Atari ST. In the late 1980s, Tramiel wanted to design a new series of video game consoles for Atari. This is where Sinclair and Flare Technology comes into play. Flare Technologies was part of Sinclair, and they started designing a new computer called the Loki. Unfortunately for Flare, the Loki didn't pan out and was cancelled. Flare Technologies was headed by Martin Brennan, Ben Cheese, and John Matheson. Flare started working with Amstrad and developed a system called the Flare 1. The Flare 1 was intended to be a home computer or a video game console, but the chipset was actually used in countertop arcade game cabinets for trivia machines. Eventually, the chipset was further developed into the Kinect multi-system prototype. This was also cancelled, but caught the eye of Jack Tramiel. In 1989, Jack Tramiel contacted Flare Technologies and made a deal to buy Flare and make it a subsidiary of Atari, calling it Flare 2. Tramiel asked them to create 2 game consoles, a 32-bit and a 64-bit one, using the Flare 2 technology that was used in the Kinect system. They started to work on both the 32-bit, codenamed the Panther, and the 64-bit, codenamed Jaguar consoles. Work on the Jaguar console proved to be going a lot faster, advancing further, leading to the Panther's cancellation. In 1993, the Jaguar was unveiled at the Chicago Consumer Electronics Show. Also, there was a test launch of the Jaguar, which saw all of the 20,000 units that were brought sold out. Atari at this point thought that they had a big hit on their hands. The Jaguar was launched on November 23, 1993 at a price of $249.99. Most of the games were not very popular, but there were a few good games. Tempest 2000, Doom, Wolfenstein 3D, and Alien vs. Predators were all released in 1993. As the consoles were starting to sell and people started buying and playing the games, one thing came to the forefront. Gamers realized the games didn't look like they were on a 64-bit system, maybe 32-bit, but not quite 64-bit. Consumers started questioning whether the Jaguar was truly a 64-bit system. Because of this, Atari kinda limped along for a couple more years until 1995, with the arrival of the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation sealing the final nail in the coffin for the Jaguar. But we'll take a quick pause here. I want to show you guys a few peripherals that were designed for the Jaguar. The first being the Pro Controller, giving you additional buttons and being designed for fighting games. Then there was the JagLink, which was a network device to connect Jaguars together for multiplayer games. Then in 1995, they released the Jaguar CD and memory track module. But unfortunately for Atari, this was not enough to save the Jaguar. By late 1995, rumors started circulating that the Jaguar was going to be discontinued in April of 1996, which it was. Then Atari agreed to merge with JTS Incorporated, and on July 30th of that year, the merger was completed. After the merger with JTS, most of the Jaguar inventory remained unsold and was moved to a private liquidator called Tiger Software in 1996. In 1998, JTS sold the Atari name and all of its Atari properties to Hasbro. But here's some interesting information about Atari and JTS. They ended up selling the console shells to a dental imaging company, which produced an imaging machine using the shells of the Atari Jaguar. Unfortunately, only a few were produced as the technology changed and the company used different products. So that brings us to the end of the Atari Jaguar story. However, it never truly died. In 1998, the Jaguar became an open source system, and many great homebrew games have been made for it. In fact, the homebrew games tend to be a little bit better than the original Jaguar games that were released by Atari. So if you ever have a chance to check out the homebrew scene on the Jaguar, it's excellent. The Jaguar did not have a very long lifespan. It started in 1993 and was discontinued in 1996, selling less than 150,000 units in total, and being the very last video game console made by Atari. Well, at least the Atari that we all grew up with.
The machine has appeared in homes across America.
Double and redouble his power. 32.
6 times more powerful than 3DO.
Alright, baby.
40 times more than Super NES.
Hey, yo, there is no 32-bit Super NES. Are we gonna see the games or what? Show me!
Increase the power meter 40 times.
Thank you.
The story of the 32X started in January of 1994. Sega president Hayako Nakayama was worried about the Atari Jaguar that was released in November of '93, taking a share of the gaming market away from Sega. This was due to the fact that Sega was already working on Project Saturn, but it was not scheduled to be released until late 1994 in Japan and mid-1995 in North America. He was so worried that during the CES show, he called Joe Miller, head of Sega of America's R&D department, and conferenced in Sega of America's producer Scott Bayless, Sega of America's vice president of technology Marty France, and Sega hardware team Hideki Sato, advising them of developing a quick response to the Jaguar. After the phone call, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske argued that they could get another year of life out of the Genesis without the need of another system. Sega of Japan disagreed and wanted a whole new system design. This started the development of Project Jupiter, a whole new system based off the Genesis. This new system would have been a 32-bit system with an upgraded color palette and some 3D capabilities. But Miller disagreed with this idea, stating that if you're just going to upgrade the same system, you might as well just make an add-on for it. Sega of Japan and America compromised, and another add-on was made for the Genesis. They discontinued Project Jupiter and started Project Mars. The Sega of America team headed the Mars project. They designed it to use 2 of the 32-bit Super H2 Hitachi CPUs that were developed in 1993 jointly with Sega for use in the Saturn. But for this project, the clock speed was reduced. The system would be able to use the Sega Genesis CPU, GPU, and sound chips. If you had the Sega CD, it could use its hardware as well. Although only 5 games were released in the CD format that used the Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X's hardware altogether. Although the system's design was more powerful than originally conceived using the Saturn's processors, it was not going to be compatible with the Saturn, being its own system. The system was marketed to people who wanted to get into the 32-bit gaming market but couldn't afford the upcoming Saturn. It was also seen as a transitional device between the 16-bit Genesis and the 32-bit Saturn. The 32X was released in November of 1994 in North America for $159 at the same time the Saturn was being released in Japan. Sales of the unit were initially strong. Over 1 million units were ordered, but Sega was only able to produce 600,000 units by the end of 1994, due to the shortage of CPUs being used in the Saturn as well. By Christmas of '94, 500,000 units were already sold, exceeding Sega's expectations. 6 games were available at launch at the price of $69.99 apiece. It didn't take long for consumers to see that the system was not as good as the hype around it. Development of the system was difficult, making it hard for Sega to secure publishers for games. Most publishers wanted to make games for the upcoming Saturn and not this transitional system. Sega sent out development kits, but by this time it was too late. Game publishers bailed on the 32X, with only a total of 40 games being made for the system, most being rushed out and not being completed. Sega was impressed with the sales figures early in the release. They started development of another system, the Sega Neptune. This was to be a Sega Genesis and 32X in one console, but soon after this, the media was starting to be very critical about Sega's strategy. Word got out about the games, and the price point, and sales started to plummet. Several of the publishers for the 32X, such as Capcom and Konami, bailed at this point. This was the beginning of the end for the 32X. By mid-1995, it was clear to Sega that the 32X was not going to be successful, and they ordered Sega of America to concentrate its efforts on the Saturn. By September of '95, the price of the units were decreased to $99. By 1996, the system was discontinued and a fire sale started, trying to clear out the remaining inventory, selling the units for $19.99 apiece. Sega had made the same mistake Atari had made, competing with itself. Also, the fact that the system was difficult to develop games for, the publishers bailed, and the price was just too high for an add-on, led to the death of the system. In the process, they lost consumer confidence as consumers saw the 32X as just a greedy money grab between the Genesis and the Saturn. That brings us to the end of the 32X. It had a very short 2-year lifespan, starting in 1994 and being discontinued in 1996, with just over 800,000 units being sold, making it Sega's worst commercial failure.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century. Humankind stands on the edge of the interactive age. You have come a long way. But are you ready for the future?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww, hit it! Sega's next-generation gaming platform, revolutionary sports and arcade gameplay, all with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems. Wow.
Sega Saturn. It's how you play the game. Go farther than you have ever gone before. Sega Saturn. Play your games in the 21st century and leave the rest of the world behind.
The story of the Sega Saturn starts in 1992. Sega knew they had to come up with the next-gen video game console to stay competitive in the gaming market. Sega's Hideki Soto headed the development team of the new console, codenamed Project Saturn. By 1993, Sega teamed up with Hitachi to develop a new 32-bit RISC CPU that would be used in the new console. The new processor would be called the Super H RISC Engine, or SH2 for short. The Saturn would be developed around a dual SH2 configuration. Sega was mostly finished with the design of the Saturn by the end of 1993, But info was leaked about the upcoming Sony PlayStation, and Sega decided to add another video display processor to the Saturn to improve 2D performance and 3D texturing too. This gave the Saturn 2 VDPs as well. During this time frame, Tom Kalasky didn't like the architecture of the Saturn and wanted to go with supercomputer maker Silicon Graphics for its 3D chips and design. Sega of Japan didn't like this idea. Nintendo later contracted with Silicon Graphics for the development of the N64. Also in 1993, Sega restructured its internal game studios to better suit development of 3D games. They enlisted Team Andromeda, which were part of the arcade development team, to design 3D games for the new console. In early 1994, the Sega Titan arcade system came to be, based off the Saturn's architecture, Acclaim being the developer for it in the United States. In early 1994, per orders of Sega of Japan, Sega of America started development of the 32-bit add-on for the Sega Genesis called the 32X. This was to be a transitional device between the Genesis and the Saturn, for people who could not afford the upcoming Saturn. It would use much of the same hardware as the Saturn, such as the SH2 CPUs, but would be incompatible. Sega of America president Tom Kalasky did not like the idea of the 32X, wanting to instead get at least another year of life out of the Genesis with no more add-ons. He just saw it as a bad idea, but Sega continued on with the development of the two 32-bit systems that would launch at the same time in 1994, the Saturn in Japan and the 32X in North America. The Saturn released in November of 1994 in Japan with the pack-in game of Virtual Fighter. The initial 200,000 units were sold out in the first day. Sega waited to release more units to the market until December 3rd, 1994, the day the PlayStation released in Japan, to stymie their sales. By the time 1994 was over, Sega had sold more than 500,000 units, while the PlayStation had only sold 300,000 units. This did not last long though, as the sales of the PS1 took off in 1995, leaving the Saturn behind. Sony started to attract more third-party developers due to the cheap licensing fee of only $10 and a well-designed development kit. In March of 1995, Kalasky announced the Saturn would be launched September 2nd in the United States. However, Sega of Japan wanted the console to be released earlier. During the E3 show on May the 11th, Kalasky announced the release of the Saturn for the price of $399. 30,000 units were shipped out to Toys R Us, Babbage's, Electronics Boutique, and Software etc., and available for sale that day. This enraged other retailers that were not advised of the release. Stores such as Best Buy, Walmart, and KB Toys stopped selling Sega products because of this. During the E3 show, PlayStation announced they would release their console at a price of $299, to the applause of the crowd.
Some of you might actually want to know what that price is. Since it's a beautiful day here in Los Angeles, I'm going to ask Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Race, to join me for a brief presentation. $299.
All this started to make Sega look bad. With its release in the US, only 6 games were ready with the pack-in game Virtual Fighter. This game was not as popular in the United States as it was in Japan, making more people wait for the PlayStation release. People started to compare games such as Daytona USA versus Ridge Racer on the PlayStation. There was a noticeable difference with Ridge Racer being almost arcade quality, while Daytona USA was just not as good as the arcade. In October, Sega announced a price reduction of the Saturn to $299, the same as the PlayStation. However, not to be outdone, Sony announced in May of 1996 another price reduction to $199. The next day, Sega announced their price reduction to the same amount as the PlayStation's. But for Sega, they were now losing money on each console they sold. By 1995, Sega still accounted for 40% of the US gaming market. But with the arrival of the PlayStation, things were taking a dramatic swing. By 1996, Kalonsky, which wanted to just continue on with the Genesis until the launch of the Saturn, wanted out of Sega. He left in September of 1996, and that started a shakeup at Sega of America. Several people either quit or moved positions, as Sega of America was being reformed. Also in 1996, Sega of America STI team was developing a new 3D Sonic game for the 32X. But since the 32X was being discontinued, it was now to be released on the Saturn. The game was to be called Sonic Extreme, and to be a fully immersive 3D world, a first for a Sonic game. The game was being rushed to be completed by December of 1996. However, the lead programmer quit, and several of the other team members got sick, and it was apparent that the game would not be completed by December. Sega canceled the game. Not long after this, the STI team was disbanded. With the cancellation of Sonic Extreme, a lack of third-party developers, being hard to develop for, and retailers refusing to sell Sega products, were all nails in the Saturn's coffin. Sony had taken the lead in the market share for gaming consoles in the US, leaving Sega behind. By 1997, Sony had 47%, Nintendo 40%, and Sega only 12% of the gaming market. By 1998, Sega was almost ready to release the next game console. With sales of the Saturn not doing well in the US and Europe, they decided to call it quits on the Saturn in those regions. It did continue on in Japan for a couple more years until the year 2000, when it was canceled there too. The Sega Saturn had a 6-year lifespan, being released in Japan in 1994 and discontinued in the year 2000, selling 9.26 million units worldwide. The console is considered to be a failure by Sega due to the early release in the US, not enough games at launch, and disagreements internally at Sega leading to bad business decisions.
Are we enjoying ourselves today, folks?
Well, if drinking white wine out of a 4-ounce glass is your idea of enjoyment, see, it's white wine in a 3-ounce glass, red in a 4.
Hey, you and the goatee. 2 words for you, pal. Lighten up. Frenchie, I need an extension cord and some buffalo wings. Go. Au revoir. Raising the roof with the coot. How you doing? Who's bored? Raise your hand. Anybody? Look who's happy now.
PlayStation.
The story of the PlayStation starts with Ken Kutungari, or better known as the father of the PlayStation. Kutungari worked behind the scenes with Nintendo to strike a deal to use the SPC 700 sound processor in the new Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Sony executives found out about this and almost fired him over it, but they decided to keep him on as a protege because the deal was just so damn successful. This started a working relationship with Nintendo. Nintendo decided to contract Sony out to build a CD add-on system for the Super Nintendo. Sony was very eager to get into the gaming market because they saw the profit that was being made by Nintendo and Sega at the time. So to secure maximum profits after they developed the SNES CD, or codenamed PlayStation, Sony was demanding all rights to the games being made on the new CD add-on. This would also transfer over to the Super Nintendo cartridges if they were being used in conjunction with the CD system. 3 years had went by, and it was 1991. At the CES show, Nintendo was showing their partnership with Sony to create the CD add-on system. Nintendo actually made this announcement, but afterwards struck a deal with Philips to make the CD add-on system for Nintendo. The next day at the CES show, this deal was announced. Folks in the gaming industry were just shocked by the news, as Sony and Nintendo's partnership had been going on for over 3 years at this point. It was a total betrayal on Nintendo's part. But Nintendo did not want to lose control over the licensing of their games to another company. Sony continued to work with Nintendo to supply them the chips for the Super Nintendo system. But really after this, there was no more business done between the two companies. And by this time, Sony had developed a standalone version of the PlayStation, which was capable of playing Super Nintendo cartridges. Nintendo would allow Sony to launch the system if they wanted, but Sony actually decided against it. The Sony suits were rethinking their business model on video games. They were really thinking about pulling out of the video game market altogether. But with successful shifting of certain divisions like the music division and creating the Sony Computer Entertainment division, they started developing a new PlayStation console. The new console would have better graphic capabilities, such as polygon 3D graphics. Sony really wanted to distance the new console from the failed attempt that they had with Nintendo. The project was called PlayStation X, or PSX. In 1993, Sony decided to go to several gaming companies to try to promote their new system. Sony at this time didn't have any in-house development, so they had to rely on third-party developers for their games. The technical details of the PlayStation, or how easy it was to develop for, made it an easy decision for developers to jump on board with Sony, including Namco, Konami, and Williams. But Sony needed to have its own in-house development team too, so in 1993, Sony acquired Psygnosis, and I know all you Amiga guys out there know who Psygnosis is. Psygnosis was later renamed to SCE Liverpool. Once Sony purchased Psygnosis, they had a team of over 500 people developing games for them. Although the system was easy to develop for, the development system that Sony had created was not easy, and folks at Psygnosis did not like it. They wanted something that was PC based and be like something that they were used to and be familiar developing on. So Sony teamed up with a company named SN Systems, and they developed the cards and software for the development system. Now there was PC interconnectivity and the ability to program and compile in GCC, which made development very easy. The PlayStation launched in Japan on December 3rd, 1994, and in North America on September 9th, 1995, and then in Europe on September 29th, 1995. During and after the launch of the PlayStation, Sony tried a different marketing strategy than any other video game manufacturer had tried before, except for Sega. Instead of marketing its game console for kids, it marketed it towards adults and older teenagers. Sony's logic to this was sound. Seeing that a generation of gamers, Generation X, that grew up with Atari and Nintendo were now adults and had expendable cash, and by marketing their console for the older gamer and not being toyish like Nintendo, adults had cash in hand and were ready to go pay for a new game system, while, children didn't. And it made the sales of the PlayStation skyrocket. The PlayStation had several different models, most of which looked the same, but in the year 2000, Sony launched the PS1 as a cost-reduced, smaller version of the console. It actually outsold the PlayStation 2 for the first 2 years after its launch. The PlayStation enjoyed a successful 12-year run, with it being discontinued in 2006 and with more than 102 million units sold.
It came from the third dimension, with its own brain, its own voice, its own legs. There's only one problem. It needs your eyes. Virtual Boy. See it now in 3D.
The story of the Nintendo Virtual Boy actually starts in the mid-1980s with a company named Reflection Technology Incorporated. They created a stereoscopic head-tracking prototype called the Private Eye, which featured a tank game. Needing funds to support their business ambitions, they went to the Consumer Electronics Show. There they showed the Private Eye prototype off to several companies including Mattel, Sega, and Hasbro. All those companies declined, but one company in particular showed interest in the Private Eye prototype, and that was Nintendo. Gunpei Yokoi, which was the inventor of the Game & Watch and Game Boy, led the engineering R&D 1 group of Nintendo. He thought the oscillating mirror display technology in the Private Eye was cutting edge. Negotiations started, and Nintendo came to a licensing agreement with Reflections Technology to use their display technology in a new game console. After years of development, the head tracking technology was dropped due to the possibility of health issues for the people using it. But Nintendo kept the oscillating mirror stereoscopic display technology. After several different colors and a full color display was tested, it was found that the red and black screen was cheaper to produce and easier on the eyes for the user. Nintendo predicted the console to be a big seller, even opening a new factory in China specifically for the production of the Virtual Boy. They predicted over 3 million units sold over Christmas time, and over 16 million units of software sold by that time as well. It debuted at the 1995 E3 and the CES shows, but already the reviews were starting to look bad. Many people at the shows had tried out the new console and complained of headaches and eye strain. The Virtual Boy was released in Japan on July 21, 1995, and in North America on August 6, 1995, at a price of $179.95. There were 4 launch games that coincided with its release: Mario Tennis, Red Alarm, Telero Boxer, and Galactic Pinball. After its release, there were several complaints from parents about headaches and eye strain from children. Even though the console warned users to take breaks, kids just didn't listen. Imagine that. Sales of the console plummeted. Nintendo tried dire promotions to show off the 3D capabilities as opposed to 2D consoles, but this marketing tactic failed as well. After the Christmas season of 1995 and the slow sales of the Virtual Boy, Nintendo decided to discontinue the production of the console and games. I'm not really sure the exact date of when it was discontinued, but I believe it had an 11-month lifespan. This was Nintendo's worst console failure, selling only 770,000 units in total.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Nope.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
No.
Is it here yet?
Let me check. No.
Is it here yet?
Pokemon Stadium 2 will be here on March 28th. Until then, $10 reserves your copy and gets you a collector's edition poster with tons of Pokemon, so you'll be ready to battle with your gold and silver characters in 3D.
Cool. Is it here yet?
No.
Rated E for everyone.
The story of the N64 really starts in the early 1990s. At this point, Nintendo knew that they needed to start development of a new system to replace the Super Nintendo and enter into the next generation of consoles. This is where Silicon Graphics Incorporated, a graphics visualization and supercomputing company, comes into the picture. SGI was looking to expand their company by putting some of their technology into consumer products. Jim Clark, founder of SGI, contacted Sega of America and spoke with Tom Kalinske. Kalinske was impressed with what he saw, but ultimately Sega decided not to buy the technology. After Sega engineers evaluated the hardware and technology, they found several issues with it and offered to buy it outright from SGI. But SGI was not willing to give up the rights to its own technology. After no deal was struck with Sega, Clark then spoke with President of Nintendo Hiroshi Yamauchi in early 1993. Nintendo was willing to license the chipset instead of owning it outright, and on August 23, 1993, Nintendo and SGI came to an agreement initiating what would be called Project Reality. The technology from Project Reality was to be used in the arcades as soon as 1994 and in the home console market by 1995. Reality Emergent Technology is the name SGI had given its components used in the Project Reality. Initially, Project Reality was developed into the Onyx supercomputer, costing $100,000 to $250,000. The game development system was filled with Reality Engine 2 graphics boards and 4 150 MHz RISC CPUs. The APIs were based on Performer and OpenGPL. On June 23, 1994, Nintendo announced the official name of its console as the Ultra 64. Developers started signing on with Nintendo, including Rare, Acclaim, DMA Designs, Ocean, and many more. Around this time, the Project Reality team prototyped a game controller for the system. They used the design cues from the SNES controller and added an analog stick with a Z button. This prototype controller eventually became the N64 controller. The design of this controller was so secretive that once developers were done using it, they had to hide it in a lockbox. While development of the console continued, Nintendo and developers started developing games on the Onyx supercomputer-based development system. Eventually, these systems were replaced by cost-reduced SGI Indie workstations, which had fully accurate console simulation boards within the system to help with the ease of development. The console was publicly revealed for the first time in 1994, and showed the console with the Nintendo Ultra 64 logo, a ROM cartridge, but still no controller at the time. In late 1994, Nintendo started licensing agreements with Midway and Williams to create arcade games based on the Ultra 64. These games were Killer Instinct and Cruising USA. Although the Ultra 64 arcade boards were based on the Ultra 64 game console, they used a different chipset with no Reality coprocessor and used hard drives. Also around this time, Nintendo decided to go ahead and rename the game console from the Ultra 64 to the Nintendo 64. This decision was based on Konami, who had ownership of the Ultra Games trademark. Nintendo was afraid they might be sued over trademark infringement, so the name was changed to the Nintendo 64, or better known as the N64. A cool tidbit of information is that the software and the hardware on the N64 still use the NUS prefix, which stands for Nintendo Ultra 64. Originally, the N64 was slated to be released by the Christmas season of 1995. However, due to hardware problems with the chips underperforming, they had to be redesigned again. The delay went on until the spring of 1996. The Nintendo software development kit was completely redesigned as a Windows-based partner N64 system by Kyoto Microcomputers. On June 23, 1996, the N64 was released in Japan, and on September 26, 1996, released in North America. The console was originally slated to be sold in the US for $250, but the launch price was reduced down to $199.99 to make it competitive with Sony and Sega. Nintendo at this point knew that Sony and Sega had basically sewed up the adult and teen market in video games, so the N64 specifically targeted preteens. The N64 was quite a successful console, selling just under 33 million units worldwide. It was eventually discontinued on April 30th, 2002. This gave the N64 a 6-year lifespan.
We got her! Hi, Randy.
Well, hello.
It's thinking.
The story of the Sega Dreamcast starts in 1995. Sega was already looking into their new console. It had been reported that they held meetings with several companies to help in the development, such as Lockheed Martin and 3DO, to name a couple. With the release of the Sega Saturn in 1994, and all the issues surrounding it, such as it being hard to develop for, lack of third-party developers, and issues with US retailers selling Sega products, all had Sega looking for a way out of the Saturn as financial losses were starting to take a toll. By 1996, longtime president of Sega of America, Tom Kalatski, had resigned his position and was replaced by Shoichiro Irimajari, and Bernie Stoller became Sega of America's vice president in charge of product development and third-party relations. With the release of the PlayStation and in 1996 the release of the N64, Sega saw sales dwindle. By late 1997, Sega only held on to only 12% of the game console market, with Nintendo being at 40% and Sony at 47%. Due to Sega performing so poorly, Sega president Hayao Nakayama, which had been president of Sega since 1983, stepped down. Irimajari took over the position, with Stoller becoming CEO of Sega of America. At this point, Sega discontinued the Saturn. By 1998, Sega had reported its first consolidated financial loss since 1988 on the Tokyo Stock Exchange. It reported a $269.9 million loss. Now, back in 1997, Irimajari hired on IBM's Tatsuo Yamamoto to head on an 11-person team to work on a top-secret project called Black Belt. Also during this time, Sega's Hideki Soto had also started development of a new console. Reports vary whether or not Irimajari had started the two-team development, or if Sato started it on his own. Sato's group decided to go with Hitachi's SH4 processor with the Video Logic Power VR2 graphics processor by NEC. This project was named White Belt, then changed to Doral, named after the female fighter in the Virtual Fighter game series. Yamamoto's team decided to go in another direction. They decided to go with the 3DFX Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee GPUs and a Motorola PowerPC 600E CPU. Sega's management ultimately decided to go with Sato's design using the SH4 and PowerVR architecture. This decision was thought to have been made because of Sega's relationship with NEC being a Japanese company. Stoller didn't like the idea of the use of the PowerVR GPU and wanted to use the 3DFX GPU, but Sega of Japan ultimately decided to go with the PowerVR, which led to a lawsuit by 3DFX against Sega for breach of contract, and was settled out of court with an undisclosed amount paid out to 3DFX. At this time, the project was renamed again to Project Katana. Also during this time, EA Games was not happy with Sega's decision to go with the PowerVR GPU either. They didn't really know how to program for it, instead wanting Sega to go with the 3DFX. Also, EA wanted an exclusive contract for sports games, which Sega didn't want to do. Because of this decision, no EA games would be available on the Dreamcast, and Sega went on to produce their own sports games along with developer Visual Concepts, which headed the 2K Sports game series. Sega touted the system to be easy to develop for, unlike their previous system, the Saturn. So easy, in fact, that you could make a game that would run on a Pentium 2 200 PC and easily port it over to the new system. Microsoft developed a custom version of Windows CE that ran on the system using DirectX's APIs and dynamic link libraries, making it really easy to port over PC games. Sega also made their own OS to be used in the development of games for the system, with most developers going with it instead of Microsoft's OS as it had greater performance capabilities. The Katana project was revealed on May 21, 1998 in Tokyo, and Sega held a public naming competition for the new system. Over 5,000 names were submitted, with Dreamcast being the chosen one, thought up by developer Kinji Uno. The name is a combination of the words dream and broadcast. It is said that Sega spent $80 million on hardware development, up to $200 million on software development, and $3 million on promotions and advertisements worldwide getting it ready for launch. The Dreamcast was launched in Japan on November 27, 1998 for the price of 29,000 yen, with 4 games available at launch. Within one day they had sold out of the entire inventory of Dreamcast. Sega at this point hoped to sell more than 1 million units by February of 1999, but only sold 900,000 units, falling short of the mark. Because of this, and the fact that Sony had just leaked info about the upcoming PS2, Sega lowered the price of the unit to 19,900 yen, which helped give Sega 17% of the console market by late 1999. In August of 1999, Stoller had been fired and Peter Moore had took over his position. The Dreamcast launched on September 9, 1999 in North America with 18 games available for the price of $199.99. But Sega had started thinking about the American market and started a contract with Hollywood Video to rent the console out before the launch date, giving people a sneak peek at the console before it actually launched. Sega also repaired its relationships with the American retailers that stopped selling Sega products after the early release of the Saturn. Sega hit a sales record, selling more than 255,000 units in the first 24 hours. By November, Sega had announced that they had sold over 1 million units. Things were looking good for the Dreamcast. But as the launch of the PS2 was coming and more info about it was coming out, sales of the Dreamcast started to slow down. The PS2's GPU is much more powerful, but the thing that kept people from buying the Dreamcast was the fact that the PS2 would be able to play DVDs and have games on DVD, giving games much more space for programs and making bigger and better games. Also, Nintendo announced their next upcoming console, the GameCube, and Microsoft started development of the Xbox. Sales of the Dreamcast dwindled, and Sega reported a net loss of $404 million by March of 2000. Moore had said for the Dreamcast to be viable, it would have to sell 5 million units by the end of the year. Unfortunately, it only sold 3 million, leaving Sega with another loss of $163 million, and by March of 2001, it had went over $417 million in losses. On May 22, 2000, Sega chairman Asio Akawa replaced Irajimami as president of Sega. He He had always wanted Sega to get out of the hardware market and become just a developer. In September of 2000, Sega held a board meeting and agreed at this point to leave the console market. On January 31st, 2001, it was announced that the Dreamcast was to be canceled in March, and Sega reduced the price of the unit to $99 to get rid of the remaining inventory. The price was reduced 2 more times to $79 and then $49. This marked the end of Sega becoming a console manufacturer. It also marked the end of an era, and the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was officially canceled on March 31st, 2001. So that brings us to the end of the Dreamcast story. With the console launching in 1998 in Japan and being discontinued worldwide in 2001, gave the system a short 3-year lifespan, selling over 9 million units in total and being Sega's last video game console.
Game over, man. It's game over.